It was a bad year for cattle, worse for men. The drought had left the plains cracked and dust-laden, the kind of dryness that made your bones ache. In Dry Creek, the wind didn't whisper. It scraped. And in the middle of that worn-out, parched town sat Samuel Hartley, landlord of 3 ranches, owner of a reputation that weighed heavier than a 6-shooter. He stood tall, built like a man carved out of ironwood and loss. His eyes shaded beneath a wide-brimmed black hat. He never smiled, not since the fire. The saloon stank of whiskey, smoke, and regret. Samuel leaned over a table scarred by knife fights and spilled deals, scrawling his name across a crinkled marriage contract. The ink bled on the page like a wound. "She's not much to look at," the broker said, scratching his neck. "Reclusive. Scar on the face, I hear. But her daddy left her 300 acres in the valley. Fertile land, untouched by drought." Samuel didn't flinch. "I'm not marrying her for her face." No one laughed. He folded the contract, pushed it across the table, and walked out without another word. Dust kicked up under his boots. Outside, children paused mid-play, wary. A drunk stumbled out of the brothel and straightened at the sight of him. Samuel Hartley walked like a man who'd buried too many things. Dreams, friends, lovers, and wasn't afraid to add another if it meant survival. They said he used to smile once, long ago, when he was in love with the preacher's daughter, Evelyn. She was music in a world of silence. Fire took her in the church in one cruel night. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered darker things. Samuel never spoke of it, only carried the scar inside. Now, with land failing and bank men sniffing around, he'd agreed to an arranged marriage with a stranger. The stagecoach arrived on the 3rd Sunday of the month, stirring up more dust than hope. Clara stepped out, cloaked in black, a veil hanging from her bonnet like mourning lace. She held herself straight, poised, not timid, not proud, just still, unreadable. Samuel watched her silently from the hitching post. The sheriff tipped his hat and backed away. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Clara moved toward him, boots barely scuffing the dirt. She offered no greeting, just nodded, as if this were a business meeting, not a marriage. "You're early," Samuel said, his voice like gravel sliding down a hill. "I prefer to arrive before judgment sets in," she answered, her voice low, calm. He blinked. That wasn't the voice of a frightened girl hiding scars. The ceremony was short, held in the sheriff's office with a Bible so old the pages coughed dust. When the time came to kiss the bride, Clara turned her cheek. He didn't try to lift the veil. He didn't need to. He wasn't marrying her for that. They rode back to the ranch in silence. Wind whistled through the broken fence posts. Coyotes howled far off, like ghosts stuck between this world and the next. The house was large but empty, a widow's kind of home. Samuel had built it for Evelyn once. Now another woman stepped inside. Clara removed her gloves slowly, her hands pale but unblemished. Her dress was modest, old-fashioned even, but her posture was regal. Martha, the cook and only other soul on the ranch, watched Clara from the kitchen with suspicion. "She moves too quiet," she muttered later. "Like a memory." Clara didn't speak much that first week. She cleaned. She organized. She repaired things without asking. She never removed the veil, not even when she watered the roses by the porch, the ones Samuel hadn't tended in years. She hummed while doing it, soft and familiar. Samuel paused the first time he heard it. That tune, he shook it off. Coincidence. A trick of memory. At supper, he asked, "You always wear that veil?" She buttered her biscuit, without looking up. Not always, but long enough to learn who sees what matters. He grunted, folding his napkin with fingers that once held a rifle steady in a hail of gunfire. He couldn't shake the feeling she was studying him without eyes, like she already knew too much. The town talked. They always did. Said he married a ghost. Said he was too proud to admit she was ugly. Said maybe she was a witch, or worse, a woman scorned come back in another's skin. Samuel ignored it all, except the dreams returned. In them, fire always raged. A church collapsed. A woman screamed his name before smoke swallowed her. And in the corner of the dream, a figure watched, silent, veiled. One morning, Samuel found her feeding a hawk perched on the fence. "They don't tame easy," he said. "Neither do I," she replied. Her veil lifted slightly in the breeze, revealing a glimpse of jawline. Smooth, no scar. He narrowed his eyes. "I thought your face was ruined." She turned to him slowly. "Do you need it to be?" He said nothing, went back to the barn, and split wood until his hands bled. That night, thunder rolled in heavy and mean. Rain lashed the windows like angry fists. Samuel lit a single oil lamp and sat in his study with a bottle of whiskey and silence for company. The storm outside couldn't touch the one inside him. Then he saw her. Across the hall, in front of the window, Clara stood, veil lifted, her face lit by lightning. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. He dropped the glass. It shattered. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. The scar was there, but faint, time-worn. Her face, older, changed, but not unknown. No, his breath caught in his throat. That was impossible. That was her, Evelyn. He stumbled back, mind spinning. The lamp flickered. Outside, the hawk screamed. She didn't move, just stood there, watching. And in that moment, a man who had buried his past realized it might not be buried at all. It might be sleeping in the next room. The wind howled all night. By dawn, the shattered glass still lay untouched on the floor. Samuel hadn't slept. He'd sat in the corner of his study like a man trying to outrun a memory on foot. His boots were muddy, his shirt half-buttoned, but his eyes were the same wild stare of a man who'd seen a ghost and wasn't sure if it was a curse or a miracle. Clara moved through the house as if the storm hadn't rattled it all night. She set breakfast quietly, black coffee, cornbread, in silence. Her veil was back on. He didn't touch the food. "You look like death rode in and shook your hand," she said softly. He stared at her. "Who are you?" She folded her hands in her lap. "Your wife." "I buried my wife." "Did you?" His heart thundered. "You're not her." She tilted her head. "Aren't I?" He slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the plates. "Don't play games with me, Clara, or whoever you are." She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "I buried Evelyn in Dawson. Her father gave me her locket. The church burned to ash. You expect me to believe she just walked out?" "No," Clara whispered. "I expect you to listen." He stood, hands trembling with fury, or maybe it was disbelief. "I don't know what devilry you're conjuring, but if this is some sick imitation—" "I'm not an imitation," she said, and her voice cracked for the first time. "I'm what's left." He froze. The room felt suddenly too small. The ticking clock sounded like gunshots. She reached up slowly, lifted the veil. And there she was. Not the girl he remembered, but the woman time had weathered. The scar ran along her left cheek, delicate but real. Her eyes, still that same storm gray, watched him with a quiet defiance, and a sadness so deep it cut. "I told them you'd come for me," she said, "but you didn't." He staggered back like she'd struck him. "Evelyn," he whispered it like a prayer, "you died." "I burned," she said, "but I didn't die." He sank into the chair, breathing ragged. "How?" She sat across from him. "My father planned to marry me off to a rancher in Abilene. Said love was for fools and weak men. You were neither, which made you dangerous to him. The fire, he said it, meant it as punishment. Said if I wouldn't obey, he'd take everything from me." Samuel's hands balled into fists. "I escaped through the back, but the roof came down. I was burned, barely made it out. By the time I reached the river, the church was gone. You were gone. Everyone thought I died. I let them." "Why?" His voice was sharp with pain. She looked down. "Because I thought you left me." He recoiled. No, I went back. I searched for weeks. My father told me you never came, that you moved on." He shook his head, voice hoarse. "I searched until the river dried. I fought anyone who called it an accident. I buried what they said was yours with my own hands." Her lips trembled. "I believed him. I was 17 and half dead, and I believed the one man I should have feared most." Samuel stood and paced, fingers dragging through his hair. The old grief resurfaced like blood through thin bandages. The silence between them throbbed with years lost. She broke it. I hid in Kansas, took a new name, found work with a widow who taught me how to be invisible. I wore the veil for safety, then for comfort, then to forget. And now, his voice was soft, raw. She looked up, eyes shining. Now I'm tired of being forgotten. A log cracked in the fireplace, punctuating the confession. Samuel sat again, staring at the woman he once planned to build a life with, the woman he mourned, cursed God over, drank himself half-mad for. And she was here, veiled in dust and sorrow. "You should have told me," he muttered. "I couldn't." "You should have." She met his gaze. "And what would you have done?" "I would have torn the world in half to get you back." A long pause. Then quietly, "You already did." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You married me under a false name. I married you with my real heart. You lied. I survived." The words hung heavy. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving only mud and broken branches. But something deeper was stirring in Dry Creek. People noticed Clara's presence, her grace, her silence, her mystery, and they talked. At the general store, whispers spread. "Did you see the landlord's wife? Tall, wears black. Creepy if you ask me. Too pretty to be hiding under that veil. Maybe she's cursed him. He's not himself." Even the barkeep muttered over cards. "I heard she floats through the house like a phantom." Samuel ignored them, but inside he was unraveling. Each day with Clara unearthed a memory. Her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she used to braid wildflowers into her hair. Each moment tested the walls he'd spent years building. She was not the same girl. And neither was he. One evening, he caught her sitting by the roses, running a finger over the petals like they were pages in a diary. The veil was gone. Her scar was exposed to the last rays of sunlight. "You used to hate roses," he said. She looked up. "I didn't hate them. I hated that my mother loved them more than she loved me. That silenced him." She rose and dusted off her skirt. "Everything we love has thorns, Samuel. Doesn't mean we stop touching it." That night, he dreamed again. Same fire. But this time, she didn't scream. She walked through the flames like they were rain, and on the other side, she stared at him, not begging for help, but daring him to follow. He woke up breathless. The next morning, he found her in the barn, stroking the old mare Evelyn used to ride. The animal, half blind, nuzzled her as if she remembered, too. "I don't know what to do with you," Samuel said quietly. "Then don't do anything. Just let me stay." "Stay as who?" She turned, eyes defiant. "The woman I've become." That answer stayed with him all day. In town, the butcher asked, "How's married life treating you, Mr. Hartley?" Samuel replied, "It's like living with a ghost that insists on being real." The butcher chuckled, but Samuel didn't. Later that night, while Clara was cleaning the hearth, he watched her in the firelight. How the scar caught the glow, how her fingers moved like they remembered every corner of the house. "I should hate you," he said. She didn't look up. "Then do." "But I can't." That made her pause. She turned slowly. "Then don't." They stared at each other. Two people reborn through ash and silence. Then she spoke, softer than before. "The past is still here, Samuel. I can feel it pressing on these walls. But I'm not asking you to go back. I'm asking if you'll let me build something forward." He swallowed. "And if I can't?" She smiled sadly. "Then I'll stay anyway. Because this time I'm not running." A beat. Then thunder in the distance, not from the sky, but from hooves. Samuel walked to the window. Riders. Dust clouds. 4 men. Fast, headed straight for the house. He turned to Clara. Her face had gone pale. "Who are they?" She didn't answer, but her hand gripped the edge of the mantel like she'd been waiting for this moment. Samuel reached for his rifle. "What aren't you telling me?" She looked at him, voice trembling. "They're not here for you. They're here for me." And just like that, the past came galloping back, with guns, dust, and vengeance in its saddle. Samuel Hartley didn't hesitate. His rifle was already in his hand. Callous fingers checking the chamber with instinct forged in older wars. Those fought with bullets, not memories. Outside, hooves pounded closer, kicking up a fury of dust that masked the men's features but not their intent. Riders didn't come like that to make conversation. Clara stood near the hearth, face pale, eyes locked on the window, like it was a portal to her worst fear. "You know them," Samuel said. She didn't nod, didn't speak. He turned to her sharply. "You said you were done running." "I am." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but steady. "But that doesn't mean they stopped chasing." Samuel swore under his breath, stalked across the room, and threw open the gun cabinet. He tossed her a revolver. She caught it without flinching. "I thought you were a preacher's daughter," he muttered. "I was," she replied, checking the weapon with more familiarity than he expected. "Then I became a fugitive. Had to learn things." "Who are they?" She took a breath like it might be her last. "Men hired by my father. He still thinks I'm property. And you let him think you were dead." "I had to. He's not the sort of man you leave clean. You escape with smoke in your lungs and a bullet in your boot." Outside, the horses skidded to a stop. For men dismounted. Dust settled enough to reveal faces, hard, sun-leathered, eyes like knives. The lead man wore a black duster and carried himself like the law didn't apply past his reach. Samuel recognized the type. One of the men stepped forward and banged a fist on the door. "Hartley, we're here for the girl." Samuel leveled his rifle toward the sound. "You picked the wrong house." The man laughed, deep and cruel. "Ain't a house in the West you can keep her in. She's got a bounty. We got papers. She's my wife. You sign a marriage paper. Don't make her yours. We got one signed by blood." Inside, Clara stood tall, gun at her side, hair unbound now and wild around her face. For the first time since she stepped off that coach, Samuel saw her as she truly was, not veiled, not ghostly, but forged by fire and fury. "I'm not going back," she said, mostly to herself. "I'd rather die." He looked at her. "You won't die." The door splintered under a boot. Gunshots followed, sharp, sudden. The first bullet buried itself in the grandfather clock. The second grazed the kitchen wall. Samuel fired once through the window. A scream answered. He ducked low, reloading, motioned to Clara. "Back door. Barn. They'll flank us." "Not if we flanked them first." The two of them moved like dancers through ruin, slipping from the back porch into the dark cover of rain-damp trees. A hawk screeched above them. Samuel cursed the sound. It could give them away. "I thought you left that bird behind," he said. "He follows me. Like trouble. In my life, they're the same thing." They reached the barn. Samuel signaled her to climb the ladder to the loft. She moved fast, nimble despite the dress, every step measured. From the loft, they had high ground. Through the slats, Samuel could see two men creeping toward the house. One held a torch. "They planned to burn it," he muttered. "I was born in fire," Clara whispered. "Let them try." He glanced at her. Something in her face had changed, no longer haunted, but hunting. Below, the torchbearer stepped toward the porch. Clara fired first. He dropped like a sack of cornmeal, the torch falling beside him. Flames licking dirt. "Nice shot," Samuel muttered. "Nice gun," she answered. The others scattered at the sound, firing blindly into the trees. Samuel picked one off with a clean shot through the shoulder. Screams rang out. The last man bolted toward the horses. Samuel jumped from the loft, hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up behind him. "Drop it." The man froze, dropped the pistol. Samuel moved closer. "Who sent you?" The man turned slowly. "We were paid." "By her father?" The man nodded. "Said she killed her mother. Said she's mad. Said she ran with a band of highwaymen. Slit their throats when they slept." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Is that true?" Clara stepped into the doorway, revolver still in hand. "Not all of it, but enough." The man stared at her like he'd seen a ghost. You ain't supposed to look like that." "Like what?" she asked coldly. "Like you know what you're doing." She fired once, near his feet, He screamed and ran. Samuel didn't stop him. He'll carry that fear further than his horse. Back at the house, smoke curled from the porch but hadn't caught. Samuel stamped out the last embers. His hands shook. He didn't notice until Clara touched his shoulder. "You saved me." He looked at her. "I nearly lost you again." "You didn't." They stood in the fading light, blood on the earth, smoke in the sky. Clara's dress was torn. Samuel's cheek was nicked by glass. But both stood taller now. Inside, they cleaned in silence. Samuel bandaged her arm, hands gentle, almost reverent. "Your father," he said, "won't stop." "I know." "Then we stop him." She met his eyes. "You help me do that?" "I'm not helping," he said. "I'm finishing what I should have years ago." She blinked once, and then we live. Or try. She smiled. For the first time since her return, it reached her eyes. That night, they sat by the fire together. No veil, no lies, just Clara, the woman who had once been Evelyn, and the man who'd mourned her. Outside, the wind picked up again. But this time it didn't scrape. It carried the scent of ash and roses. And something was coming with it. The sun rose blood red, over dry, creaked the morning they came for him. Sheriff Lanton arrived with a posse and a warrant, his hat low, his boots mud-caked from a night storm. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just handed Samuel Hartley the folded paper and said, "You're under arrest for the killing of 2 men on your land." Samuel took it without flinching. Clara stood behind him on the porch, veil gone, scar unhidden. Her hand twitched near the hem of her dress, where she kept her pistol. "They came to burn us alive," she said. "I know," the sheriff replied, regret thick in his voice. "But the law don't always care who lit the match, only who pulled the trigger." Samuel nodded once, jaw tight, eyes on the dirt. "Let me get my coat." They didn't shackle him. Didn't need to. Samuel Hartley wasn't the kind of man to run. Not from this. Clara followed him into town, riding behind a wagon in her black dress. The old mare Evelyn used to love carried her like a queen in exile. Folks stared, whispered, children pointed. She didn't blink. The jail was small, just 2 cells and a desk that slanted to one side. Samuel sat on the cot, his hat beside him. Sheriff Lanton paced outside the bars. "I don't want this," the sheriff said. "Neither did I," Samuel replied. "Judge is coming in from Elgin. He's got orders to make an example. Word is the man you shot was the son of a rail baron." Samuel let that settle in the air. Clara stood in the corner, hands folded. "He tried to kill me. They all did." "I believe you, Miss Hartley." "Then stop this." "I can't. Trial's happening, with or without your blessing." She turned to Samuel. "Then we make them listen." "No one listens to ghosts," he muttered. She stepped closer. "Then I'll speak louder." 3 days passed. Long days. Samuel didn't sleep. He stared at the stone wall like he could carve a future into it if he just looked hard enough. Clara came each day with food, but they barely spoke. On the 4th day, the trial began. It was held in the church, the rebuilt one. Irony, perhaps. Wooden pews creaked beneath gossip-heavy bodies. The judge sat at the pulpit, robe stiff, expression stiffened further by the heat. Samuel stood tall in the defendant's place, shirt clean, eyes hard. Clara took a seat behind him. Martha, the cook, came too, along with 2 ranch hands and a quiet stable boy who used to leave flowers by the door. The prosecution painted Samuel as a bitter old gunman with a bloody history, quick to shoot and slow to think. They said Clara was a mystery woman, suspicious, manipulative, maybe even cursed. The judge listened without blinking. When it was Clara's turn, the room quieted like it sensed something holy or dangerous was about to rise. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "No veil, no shame. My name is Clara Evelyn Hartley," she said. "I was born Evelyn Dawson. I was declared dead 16 years ago. That declaration was a lie." The room gasped. She told them everything. The fire, her father's deal with cruel men, the escape through the rear chapel door, the years in hiding. the bruises that faded, the nightmares that didn't, the bounty placed on her like she was a wild animal, not a daughter. She told them about the night they came, the torches, the bullets, the bodies. And she said, Samuel Hartley didn't save me. He stood beside me while I saved myself. The judge leaned forward. You expect this court to believe you faked your own death, reappeared under a new name, married a man who thought you were someone else, and just happened to be the same woman he lost? I don't expect it, she said, but it's the truth. You have proof. She stepped forward, placed an old locket on the table. Inside it, a faded photo, her and Samuel much younger. Inside the lid, an engraving. Come back to me if the world burns down. The judge turned it over in silence. I wore that under my dress the night of the fire, she said. He gave it to me, and I kept it even when I hated him. The room was still. No one breathed. Sheriff Lanton stood. We found a burned church record 2 months ago, under a collapsed wall. One name survived, Evelyn Dawson. The judge looked at Samuel. Do you believe this woman is your wife? Samuel stood slowly, looked at Clara like she was both fire and salvation. I believe she always was. Outside, the townfolk waited. When the doors opened and the judge's gavel declared, not guilty, some grumbled. Others nodded, but none spoke against it. Samuel walked free. Clara met him at the steps. I told you I'd speak louder, she said. You roared. They returned to the ranch that night. The damage had been patched, the porch reboarded, the blood scrubbed clean. But something had shifted. He took her hand, callous fingers lacing with hers. I don't know what this is now, he said, but I want it. So do I? She looked up at him. Even with the scars? He traced her cheek with a touch so light it barely existed, especially with the scars. Weeks passed. The roses bloomed again. Clara tended them without gloves now. The townsfolk grew used to her scar, her strength, her silence. Some even came to admire her. One afternoon, a little girl from the edge of town asked, Are you a witch? Clara smiled. No, but I've burned like one. The girl laughed. Can you teach me? Clara knelt. I can teach you how to survive. Samuel watched from the porch, a book in one hand, a rifle leaning idle by the door. He had never imagined this life. But sometimes a fire doesn't end things. It forges them. At night, they sat together on the porch swing, the hawk still circling above, faithful as ever. Samuel leaned close. You once said everything we love has thorns. I did. And I'm still holding on. She turned to him, eyes bright. Then maybe it's time we planted something new. As the stars lit up above Dry Creek, Samuel Hartley, the man who once buried his heart, finally felt it beat again. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because some love stories aren't written, they're forged in fire.